I'm here today with John Roberto. John's latest book is Lifelong Faith, Formation for All Ages and Generations from Church Publishing. John has been teaching, writing, researching, consulting, and developing program resources in faith formation since 1969. He was the founder of the Center for Ministry Development, where he worked for 28 years. From 2001 to 2006, John was the creator and project coordinator of the Generations of Faith Project, a 5-year Lilly Endowment initiative to develop intergenerational faith formation in Catholic parishes across the United States. In 2006, he founded Lifelong Faith Associates, LLC, to continue that work. John lives in Chester, Connecticut, and you can learn more at lifelongfaith.com. Well, John, it's such a pleasure to meet you and to have you, speak with us. You've done such an amazing amount of work. I just really thank you for that.
Thank you.
So before we get into the books, though, can you really tell folks more about, kind of what I just briefly touched on, all those years of amazing work?
Yeah, my journey, I'm Roman Catholic, and I started as a diocesan director of youth ministry. So like I always say, everybody had to spend at least 15 minutes in youth ministry. But I spent decades, and a lot of the knowledge and skills and work that I did in youth ministry translated really well as I expanded the work I did to family and then intergenerational faith formation. And then for the last 25 years, really thinking about how do we think about the whole lifespan. So even when I was working in youth ministry, we were always involving families, always thinking about young people in terms of what's come before their life and childhood, and how to prepare them for the rest of their life in terms of a lifelong faith. So coming to the lifelong piece is a way for me to integrate a lot of the insights that I've developed and worked with in terms of training and writing and researching, but really to kind of capture the fact that the churches are really charged with thinking about how do we help people grow from birth through all the decades of life. And now that we're a 10-decade society, it's how you help people grow for 10 decades. And that has not been our dominant practice, as we're all very aware of that. And so sometimes our focus is on children and the younger years, the teenage years. But we had to see everything in kind of a broader perspective. And that's the work that I really started engaging in. And whether it's engaging families more fully in the life of the whole life cycle, parents, grandparents, and children, or thinking about how we do intergenerational, and those intergenerational communities, how we connect all the generations relationally for prayer, for reading the Bible, for learning together, developing a whole variety of models where we engage them more fully and on Sunday. All that work is for me, is kind of integrated into thinking lifelong. And we're blessed. I mean, in 2022, we've got resources and tools and models and approaches that any church can become lifelong. There's all kinds of challenges, but I think the way we think about faith formation has really been transformed from what was just decades ago, a real emphasis really on children primarily, and then some teenagers, or at least until in many denominations to confirmation somewhere in the teenage years, to really thinking about how we grow faith across the whole lifespan, and how churches and families and homes and now online, how we think more holistically about the whole process.
Well, being a grandparent myself, my view on all of that has changed too over the years. But you work across denominations, a wide spectrum of different, faith traditions, correct?
Yes. And I was formed ecumenically, even though I worked in the Roman Catholic world for decades. The early people that formed and shaped my thinking about faith formation, John Westerhoff is an example, were people who were writing across traditions. And I found when we think about faith formation or Christian education, however you want to name it, but when you think about faith formation, the kinds of insights and understandings, the theories, the practices really go across all the Christian churches. I mean, the things that we try to engage people with in terms of lifelong faith, growth and discipleship, those are things that every church shares in common. And I think people are often surprised that they share so much in terms of their vision and their practice of faith formation. But I've found it relatively easy or simple to bring these to a wider audience. And then it's always contextual. So I think the best thing is that the vision and the theory and the practices are transferable across churches, but it's always contextual. what's our particular church like? What's our particular theological convictions? Who are our people? What are the different the ethnicities and socioeconomics and all the rest? But I think at least I've been informed with, when you think about the broader approaches, like John Westerhoff's, kind of the socialization and culturation model you talked about, the whole church, those kind of approaches, Maria Harris's approaches in Fashion Me a People, those just translate everywhere. It's how you put them into practice is what's unique in every church. So working ecumenically has been a true gift. I mean, the last 20 years I've had a chance to work ecumenically, and it's just been a gift because I think people recognize, God's working in all of us and through all of us in our churches and our leaders. And in faith formation, I find it relatively easy to share across the traditions and to enrich each other. And that's been a blessing.
Well, I really love that, you have that mindset because, our faith society has been so siloed, and it's just kind of always been amazing to me how, the X's don't talk to the Y's and whatever.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
We have our particularities and uniquenesses, but there's so much more in common that we share. And, it's often funny, but when I was doing a series of workshops in the early 2010s on 21st century faith formation, and so one of the groups was like 12 different denominations were present. And I said to the whole group, like halfway through the 3-day program, I said, I'm pretty sure you can't pick out the Roman Catholics from the Methodists, from the Episcopalians, from the because you're all sharing a common language and a common concern for your people that everybody shares, and a love of the gospel. So it's refreshing because people are able to get new insights and new approaches when you step outside your own zone, so to speak, and are able to see what everybody else is doing.
Really, absolutely. So before we get into the new book, could you tell folks more about the previous books that you've written?
Yeah, the Lifelong Faith book that I just published with Church Publishing, it really has kind of it goes all the way back to 2010 in many ways. It's been kind of a 10-year, 1 decade kind of evolution. In 2010, I gathered, and actually in 2009, I gathered a group of people, and I just posed the question, what could faith formation look like in 2020? And so we did a book called Faith Formation 2020. And we did a 2-day kind of scenario envisioning what could this be like. And the Pew Research had just come out with the insights about the growing unaffiliation or the spiritual but not religious. And those were all new languages in 07, 08. That was kind of like new insights, right? And so when we gathered, that became part of our way of interpreting the future of faith formation. In what ways are we going to be engaged with the actives? How are we going to engage the occasionals? How are we going to engage the spiritual but not religious? And how are we going to engage the unaffiliated? And that kind of launched me into saying, how do we integrate a lot of the insights that we already have and put this into a broader lifelong frame? And then in 2015, I did a book called Reimagining Faith Formation for the 21st Century. And that kind of crystallized it and said, okay, here's some approaches, here's some practices. And then when I started writing in 2020, the Lifelong Faith book, it was like I've been working this, training this, watching churches do this. I think I can integrate these things together and say, here's a path towards lifelong faith in every church. You'll contextualize it, you'll think through it, you'll apply it, you'll borrow from here or there. But basically, how do you embrace a lifelong vision, and then how do you develop practices that will get you to implement that vision in your church? So for me, it was kind of a 10-decade journey. In many ways, it was built on the prior 40 years of being involved in faith formation.
Interesting. So it sounds like it's pretty comprehensive then in nature.
It is. I mean, the Lifelong Faith book, so I mean, just a little bit of my journey towards this. So I kept on, I mean, the final book that got published, I think was the 4th or 5th book I wrote to finally get the one I really wanted. But what got me going on it is I watched Salman Nasrat's wonderful Netflix show on salt, fat, acid, heat. And she thought, you take these 4 ingredients, 4 elements of all cooking, and you can cook anything. And I thought, okay, I'm not so much concerned about cooking everything, but I love this approach to saying there are some building blocks that when you put them together, make for great cooking. And then I watched their Netflix show. I even bought the cookbook. Asked me how much I actually cook, but I bought the cookbook. But I began to think about her methodology and also how she taught. I think she's a wonderful teacher. I would recommend everybody watch the Netflix show, not to learn how to cook, but watch her teach and engage you in the process. And I thought, what if I could take that approach and apply it to lifelong faith? Because it's so big, it's so comprehensive, it overwhelms people. And so the 7 elements of the book are my take on salt, fat, acid, heat. That if you take these 7 elements, like goals for a lifelong faith maturing, or thinking about programming in networks rather than linear programming, if you took these, you could build a lifelong faith formation plan for your church, a multi-year plan that would put you on the road to addressing life needs and life stages all across the lifespan. So I kind of tip the hat to her for putting me onto thinking, if you get the elements down, whether you're working with 1 decade or multiple decades or families or the whole lifespan, you can build out lifelong faith formation in your church over 10 decades. So that was kind of, that became the organizing principle of the book, to think around these 7 elements, and then how do you integrate those, and then how do you build the capacity to do lifelong faith formation in your church.
Wow, very cool. So in the little book description, it says that there's some new research that is also contained in the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the research pieces. I mean, I've one of my background, I was a sociology major, so I've always had this kind of the social research kind of thinking, and to see how do you bring research, but not just to do research, but how do you translate research into practice so that it influences the way we do things. And so the book is kind of filled with, we've learned a lot about intergenerational learning and the power of intergenerational relationships over the last 10, 15 years. How do we bring that into practice? We know a lot about families and the role that parents play. Christian Smith is one example of the research he's did, not just on young people, but the last 2 books he's done are on religious parenting. And so how do we take those insights, which are very actionable, and put them into practice? So my whole goal is to say that no, the typical Christian ed director, faith formation director, pastor is not going to be able to read all this research. Can we distill some of the key insights that are actionable and say, if you want to work with families, here's 4 big insights around families, like the role that parents play, or family faith practices, or the style of parenting. You can apply those to the way you do and design family faith formation from youngest all the way through the adolescent years in those first 2 decades of life. So that's kind of the research is not mine. It's my translating that research into why is intergenerational so important? Why is family so important? And then how do people learn today? Learning has changed dramatically. I don't just mean for children and teens, I mean across the lifespan. And so we have a lot of outdated notions of learning and education that inform a lot of our practice and have informed it. And so in many ways, I always, at a workshop, will always say, I have a Rip Van Winkle moment every single time I do a workshop, because, you think about what churches are doing with, classrooms and books and the rest. You could have walked into a 1965 church and found exactly the same thing. So like if you had fallen asleep in 65 and woke back up in 2022, you would have known exactly what to do on Sunday morning and what classroom to have gone to,
That's
and so
funny.
what other aspect of life would that be still true for? Right? Very few. So that's part of our getting in touch with this whole body of educational research on learning sciences, how the brain works, that is going to really influence the way we do faith formation today. So I try to bring some of those insights in as well. So there's research kind of throughout when I do workshops, courses, teaching the rest, but it's actionable. So it's not research just for research sake. It's here's insights that you can act on that would really improve the way you work with children, teens, adults, families, etc.
So do you view the book as primarily aimed at faith leaders, churches?
Yeah, I think it's going to be it's a book that every pastor, every faith formation leader, teams, so I've had a couple of people who knew me said, all right, I just ordered 10 of these books and my team's going to work through this and we're going to build this out. And I can tell people you're thinking about a 3-year time frame here. You're not thinking about how do I do everything, in the fall of 22. How do I start building out a lifelong plan? So it's definitely written for congregational leaders, church leaders, pastors, faith formation leaders, teams that they work with. Some people are adopting it as seminary text, or university text, people, ministry students, Christian ed students who are, how to think about lifelong faith formation. Denominational leaders, who are doing workshops and courses and that kind of thing. It kind of gives you vision, practice, and kind of a blueprint to work from. So it's always I always kind of walk that line between descriptive and prescriptive. You don't want to be prescriptive because there's so much diversity, but you want to describe it well enough that you give people a strategy and direction. So people are using it at all those levels, but it's fundamentally about how do we transform faith formation and Christian education in our churches, and how to think broadly. And when I say churches, I mean the church, the home, the community, online. I mean church broadly. So yeah, that's the target audience.
Well, before we started the interview, you and I were talking about several different things. One of them being, that there are so many nuns now, not affiliated. And so, have you thought about a version of your work oriented toward them?
Well, it's how to orient church leaders to a bigger view of their church. Like I always say, how big is your campus? So when I'm doing I do a day-long lifelong faith workshop built around the concepts and the ingredient and the 7 elements of the book. But I start with this initial couple of slides, and I describe, where's a place in your community where that includes everyone, and that has outreach, that well, it's a library is what I'm describing to people. Like, and during the pandemic, libraries really expanded their focus, that it's not about a library, it's about the whole community and how we service people. Home kits that went home to families, reading groups, they just did all kinds of creative things. And I said, libraries don't think of themselves as a book repository. They think of themselves as a center for lifelong learning. And if we took that approach in church and said, as a community, we are a center for lifelong learning, religious learning, spiritual learning, and we're for everybody in our community. And then you started thinking about the different audiences. How do I work with people who really want to grow the next step in their faith growth and really want more in depth? But how do I think people who really are spiritual? There was a great article this week, and I'm going to forget the magazine I read it in. It said, what's the problem with people being spiritual? That was kind of the article. What's the problem here? Wouldn't that be a good thing for us in church to say people are open to the spiritual life? And so how do we pick them up and address their needs where they are? But you have to have a bigger view of church to do that the whole community is our campus. And therefore we want to engage people in looking at their life spiritually, helping people be better and more confident and comfortable parents, and bring a spiritual focus to their parenting. We can continue to offer things that help them grow religiously, or invite them to say, you might want to join, become part of our community to be able to be nourished and supported and encouraged and, go deeper in relationship with God. But if we just thought bigger, we could accompany, I always say there's 4 different kind of styles, if you will, from not really engaged in church at all, nor they want to be, to be actively engaged. We can engage everybody if you thought broadly and then thought more about it's putting things in front of people and addressing people around their needs, not the church's needs.
Yeah.
We just got to shift the focus that, well, we're here to do this. And I think you're here to engage and respond out of the gospel that is very inclusive. Everybody, here comes everybody in Jesus' ministry. Here comes everybody. We can do that in our local church. And so we don't need to separate people out. We just need to have a bigger view of where church ministry and faith formation happens. And it's really a shift for faith formation leaders, pastors as well, because we've just have been so locked into, in quotes, the Sunday school mentality. You come to us and we give you something, rather than say, if you do faith formation really well, it's an outreach ministry. It's engaging people in homes and online in small groups, the cafe, at the library, wherever it might be. If we adopt that mentality, every church can be a center for lifelong learning and formation. It's just not that hard, because we have examples all around us. So I tell people, go to a library tomorrow. After the workshop is over, go to a library, see what they're doing. Look it up on the website, and you'll see that they've reimagined themselves over the last decade to really be centers of lifelong learning.
I love that mindset and the approach that you have. And, this whole idea of thinking of the customer first, thinking externally instead of internally, I mean, is the fundamental pieces of marketing that I preach to all the authors that I work with. It's not about you.
Yeah,
It's about how you can serve your audience.
yeah.
And you're saying the same thing that churches need to think that way, which I totally agree with.
I mean, a decade ago, this would have been harder to do because we would have lacked some of the technologies like the
Mhm.
digital tools or
Yes.
the familiarity. Now, nobody can say they don't know how to use Zoom after 2 years of
Right,
the
right.
pandemic, right? Or how to use a website. But we also have great digital resources available for all age groups and targeted different audience. So we have a resource abundance, and we have to match that with a faith formation infrastructure, so to speak, that is big enough to work with all of these resources to address the diversity of our needs. Having diversity of needs is just not a problem. It's something we can easily do.
So I'd like to read part of one of the endorsements for the book. It's from Corey Siebel. He says, John Roberto maps out a vision of faith formation that is hopeful, creative, timely, wise, and thoroughly practical. That last piece, I just love, right? Because it's not theoretical, it's practical, right? So how would you say that you've gone about the book and your work with that as a goal?
Yeah, I've tried to like in each of the 7 elements, script out how to apply that element. And then after I'd written those, I said, I need a chapter where you integrate all this. So it's a whole chapter on how to integrate this, develop a model of lifelong faith formation for your church, and then how to get to that model, but also how to script out the moves. So you take the 7 elements and you can build a plan. And sometimes, and I tell churches that you can build a plan decade by decade or age group by age group. I mean, so it's not like you don't have to start with here comes everybody. Oftentimes they'll say, look where the gaps are. So if you're not doing a lot with your mature adults and older adults, well, that's low hanging fruit. You should, build out something good for them. If you're not doing anything with parents from baptism to like first communion time, then focus on that. And you can start building this out in stages. So in 3 years, you say, wow, we have a lifelong faith plan that we've built over time. So I'm just I try in the book to reduce the overwhelming feeling, oh my God, we can never do this. To say, start with your assets and your strengths, and then start with gaps in your lifelong plan, areas that are of greatest need. And I would say, if you're in doubt, you can't go wrong starting with parents and families from 0 to 6, because most churches don't. Now, some churches have godly play or catechesis of the Good Shepherd, so they do something with that. But even those are not really family-centered. They're more child-centered, which is fine. I mean, that's not a problem. But develop a plan there. And now you got the digital tools and resources to reach parents from birth and baptism right through to first communion. And that starts a pattern of staying in continuity. So many churches have what I call start and stop faith formation. We do something now, and then then people go on sabbatical and they come back for maybe another sacrament or ritual or milestone. Or like, close the gaps. So even if all you did over the next 3 years was say, we've got gaps that we can close. And if you're working with families and parents with 0 to 6-year-olds, you're working with children and parents and grandparents. So it's intergenerational. So there's no one place to start, but I say build. You don't have to start with what you have. You can build out around the things that are gaps for you, and start with the low hanging fruit on the tree. Start with the biggest need and interest might be, and then build out. And over 3 years, you'd be amazed at what you can accomplish.
So as you know, I work with a lot of writers. So what advice would you have from a writing perspective for someone new that's kind of getting started in this area?
Well, I never envisioned ever being a writer. People say all the time, oh, you write a lot. I said, I write a lot of things because there just wasn't anything else but available that I could use. So I started writing. I was a sociology major and a theology major, right? So my degrees in religious ed and sociology. So it's like, I didn't come out as a writer. People think, I started doing a lot of program writing, like program materials for churches, children, youth, adults, and families, and that kind of thing. And so, but early on, I started editing and then doing some writing, because we were writing materials for courses we were teaching in youth ministry and family ministry and intergen. And so that was the impetus behind it. And so People say, well, you got all these ideas. I said, yeah, but the ideas all come out of the field. Like I'll do training and writing. I'll write up the experience of that. I'll create resources and write up the experience. So like the Lifelong Faith book goes back to 2010 and 2015. And this was okay, I learned what didn't work and what did work. So for me, I always need to write out of my experience of working with people in churches and for them, so it's always like, this is not available. I have a chance to synthesize this, bring some research, some theology, some faith formation theory into a practical resource. So I always say, I have the people in front of me, like I have the photographs in front of me, and I'm writing for them. And when I'm reviewing what I write, I think, oh no, they're not going to, this won't work for them. They know that, or they'll look at this and say, this is too overwhelming. They'll go, change the pages, And so it's knowing what I think can both be challenging, but also doable and feasible for a pastor, faith formation leader in churches. But my writing always just comes out of prior experience and work with people, and then say, okay, let's synthesize that and pull that together. But I never, ever, if people said when they got into ministry, a long time ago, oh, you're going to write books, I would have looked at them and said, you have to be kidding me. Writing books, I had just the prerequisite English classes I needed to get out of college. I mean, really, not to write a book. So I've learned with the help of really good editors, I just have to say that, of how to write, and from feedback from people who use the book, So like people would say, this was really good. I didn't get that. Like, what do you do with this? So that was always the question I would get. Like, so what do you do with that? Like, this is good, but what do you do with it? So it's almost like I should have a poster over my screen that says, what do you do with this? Or so what? You made this point. So what? How's it make it different? And that really has guided me. And I think the Lifelong Faith book for me is the best representation of my ability to answer the so what question and how do we move ahead question. And just synthesizes a lot of work. And I often say books start as handouts at workshops, and then they evolve and you put scaffolding around it. So Lifelong Faith books is my best example of that.
That's great. That's great. So looking forward, you've got this book out, you're doing workshops and everything. Is there any other books on the horizon or any other new projects that you can talk about?
Well, what I would love to do with the Lifelong Faith book is a reader of kind of case studies of churches. I'm probably a year plus away from something like that, but there's nothing that really supports innovation and adoption than saying, look, here's a church of 100 members and look what they did. And here's a church of 5,000 members. Look what they did. Here's a church in a city or a suburb. Here's a multi-ethnic church. Here's an ethnically specific church, one ethnic group. That's the kind, people are always looking for the stories of practice. And so if there's something I would love to cultivate are the stories of practice. And I would love to do, I'd love to do eventually, I did a little preliminary study before the pandemic, a research study on lifelong faith formation, like asking churches what are you doing? How important is this? Where do you see your gaps? I'd love to go back in the field, but somebody who's a professional sociologist to run a study and just saying, this is what's making a difference in the lives of people. So I do see a couple of things coming out of this, but the pandemic kind of, you always have to take the 2 years out in terms of thinking about implementation, but it gave me a chance to write the book, which was just a blessing for me. And to spend time with it, and to really think about what would be the next steps. But I do think the case studies of real life churches and a more formal kind of research study of what makes a significant impact. Like, we know these things about families and parents are important. Well, here's examples of where this is making an impact. That would really help people feel comfortable about moving away from their current model into some new innovative models of mission.
Makes a whole lot of sense. Well, John, thank you so much for all your work
Brian,
and for
you're welcome.
sharing it with us and everything. Again, the name of the book is Lifelong Faith, Formation for All Ages and Generations. You can find it from Church Publishing, and you can learn more about all of John's work at lifelongfaith.com. John, thanks again for joining us, and
You're welcome.
congratulations on all your work and best wishes going forward.
Thanks, Brian. Pleasure.